Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for .NET Aspire Day. I'm going to be doing a session on aspiring.net with Azure OpenAI, show how we can integrate AI services into our Aspire applications. So my name is Chris Ayers. I'm a senior customer engineer at Microsoft. I'm on the Fast Track for Azure team, which is part of CXP, Customer Experience Program. I speak and blog a lot, and I have quite a few demos and samples out on GitHub. So please go out there and check out what I have or see my blog. Today, we're going to talk about, and I'll go over these kind of quickly so we can get to the demos and have some fun with code. But why .NET Aspire? Some of the integrations available, how to consume some of these resources, local Azure development. And this is what we'll be leveraging quite a bit, as well as deploying to Azure through the Azure Developer CLI. And then, like I said, lots of demos. So .NET Aspire is designed to improve the experience of building cloud-native apps, .NET cloud-native apps. And this is what I love about Aspire, because there are some pain points, and Aspire helps solve a lot of these through orchestration, through integrations, and through tooling. And like I said, I'll move through these rather quickly. We have a whole day of .NET Aspire. So I'm going to reiterate, I guess, a little bit. But, when I have multiple services, an API and a front end and a back end, and I want to spin them up, I don't want to open multiple windows or tabs or terminals and run the commands over and over again. Being able to quickly configure my apps so that they talk to each other easily through connection strings is super easy, and credentials. I love the monitoring and logging capabilities of the dashboard, and I can easily spin up containers for backend services like Redis or Postgres or SQL Server. And so these integrations are incredible. We have so many of them. I can run local emulators of things. I don't have to worry too much about authentication, and integrating them is relatively simple, just through adding some NuGet packages. I don't have to dive deep into infrastructure of code. And the tooling is great on both the Visual Studio side and Visual Studio Code. There's some great templates there. The .NET Aspire dashboard's incredible. We'll use that quite a bit. And, the app host really lets us coordinate all the different pieces of our application and handle that distributed aspect of it. And then service defaults let us bake into our application best practices and policies that we want through retry and health checks and all of those things that are best practices. So those integrations, there are two sides to it. One side is the hosting side. So in that app host where we lay out our dependencies for our project, this can manage our resources. It can help automate that infrastructure setup and really drive the configuration, the wiring up of our various services. We don't have to start 5 projects in Visual Studio. We can just start app host. And on the client side, it makes it really easy to consume those different dependencies and resources, those integrations, through service discovery and just wiring up things through the configuration. And like I said, the service defaults and logging. So these really come together in a wonderful way. And we'll show that. I'm going to take you through a journey on some code. And we have integrations for not only .NET applications and .NET projects, but maybe I need to invoke a Node front end. Maybe I'm doing something with React. I want to just invoke that through my app host. I can do that. Or if I have some Python code on the back end and I want to integrate that with Aspire, I can. If I easily want to spin up a container, that's quite easy to do. And I don't have to go hunt around and figure out what port things are running on. I can be very explicit in how that's configured in .NET Aspire. And then I have all sorts of services I can use and consume. And we're going to deal with OpenAI today. But if I was running it locally on my laptop, I could change it, maybe spin up a Docker container into a Llama. If I wanted to start building a RAG application and have data and Postgres or SQL Server, I I can leverage that. We might look at adding Redis to our application later, or if I had some messaging or storage. There are lots of great integrations baked into .NET Aspire, and it's open, so it's all extensible. And as we go through and we try to consume some of these resources, I've hit on quite a few of these a couple of times, but service discovery and defaults, service defaults, they're wonderful. If I use launch profiles in Visual Studio Code or for my different .NET applications, .NET Aspire respects those. It pays attention to them. If I want to make sure I have health checks, if I'm running a containerized workload and I want to have some sort of health check to make sure my container is running successfully, those are part of some of our service defaults enabling those. Even telemetry, so that we can use the dashboard and have distributed logging and tracing. And when I talk about service discovery, this is the really cool part. Some components, and I'm sure we're going to touch on this in other sessions, want connection strings. Others maybe just expose an endpoint, a URL, a port. And so depending upon the services I reference and use, it provides what's needed to the client side. So if, for instance, I make a backend API and I pass that reference to my front end, it might just pass API service and then the port for HTTP or the port for HTTPS. If I'm referencing Redis and that's started in a container, but I would connect to it with a database connection string, it might create a connection string environment variable. And because of the way .NET configuration works, it loads these into the configuration system. I can override them with app settings, with other environment variables. And so it's a very easy way to do some service discovery as well as configuration as I deploy up into the cloud. Which leads me to local Azure development. So not everything can be an emulator. Not everything can be a container. Sometimes when I hit F5, I need to connect to a real service running in the cloud, like Azure OpenAI. And so in those cases, I need to provision resources in Azure. And those might come from a very, wide array of sources where my credentials are leveraged. Maybe I've logged into the Azure CLI or PowerShell, or maybe I use Visual Studio to do this, or VS Code. There's a lot of different ways I can make sure that the right credentials are passed out into Azure. And I'll show you how we can configure some of these in Visual Studio for deploying out to Azure. And then once I've built my app and I started to get it running, I can leverage the deployment manifest. So I'm sure we're going to talk about this in other sessions, but the Azure .NET Aspire deployment manifest gets generated from our app host. And this is a cloud agnostic capability. So if I use just containers and stuff, it will show the different containers and ports I need to leverage. But we usually use the Azure Developer CLI. So I can go azd init and it will scan my application, and I can host my workload, my solution out on Azure Container Apps. I can get all that telemetry I need with application insights. And so going into an Aspire app, azd init, scan everything, look at that manifest. It'll generate bicep files for me in memory and provision those out into Azure, and then it'll do my deployments. And I'll publish containers, so I don't even need a Docker file for my .NET because it can use some of the new capabilities from .NET 8 and 7 to publish to containers directly and push them up into the registry and run them on container apps. So there's some really cool stuff. So let's start doing some OpenAI with Aspire and leverage, English is our new programming language, or if English is not your first language, you have a different native language. Most of the GPT models will work with those. So let's go play with some demos real quick. Now I'm going to start out with a super basic application. We're going to build our way up. So I'm going to have a website, and this is just a super basic .NET new, and we have our weather controller, and it displays the weather and has some random data it gets. Now, the first thing I'm going to do to start preparing my app, maybe to integrate into um, Aspire, is I'm going to split some things out. So I've got all this checked into a repo. I will share this, but instead of generating my code locally, how about we call it from an API? So, I'm going to go get that data from my API. And this is my weather API service. I've got that exact same code we saw before running here with the weather forecast endpoint. And so I have not added Aspire yet. All I've done is split out the endpoint. And if I look in my program, I have to put in my local host and my port. I have to override this. I have to change this when I go out and deploy into Azure. But locally, I can hit F5 and run my application locally. And I'm going to go ahead and try that now. I don't want to attach to a process. Oh, I know why. So this is where things get annoying. I have to change my startup process. This is that pain that we face where I might want multiple startup programs so that I can start these and run my application. It's not as ideal as I would like. Waiting for everything to start up and build. I've got a couple of windows opening up for me and my browser opening up. And this is what I need to do to get everything working and running. And there we go. Here's my application. I've got one here and one here. Not ideal, but I can hit my counter and click on it and I go to my weather and this will call my backend service. So I've got my two pieces of code running and I can invoke it. Okay, so we've got the first step done. Let's add Aspire and see if we can make this a little bit easier. So I'm gonna move forward in my commit a little bit. And now, if you notice, we have two new project API service. We added our front end and a reference to our API service. And we've got all of our service defaults here that are going to bring in OpenTelemetry, health checks, service discovery, and resiliency. So retry. And I can look at my web page. And now I've got my service defaults added to my website. And I'm invoking my client now by friendly name, API service. And the rest of the code really is unchanged. I still got the same weather service. I'm still just calling it, on that. Everything is fine. And once you've added Aspire, you can, of course, add this to the tooling with add .NET package or orchestrator support. If you've already added it, you add orchestrator. Do that. Well, now let's start adding OpenAI. And this is where things start getting fun. So I mentioned all of those great packages that we can leverage. So let me just close all these tabs and we're going to start looking at what we've done. So if we look at the app host, I've now added OpenAI and a deployment. And if I want to double check, let me look at my NuGet packages for this solution. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing this. So I will just go ahead and move up to my main branch just to get things hopefully back where they need to be. A couple of little tweaks here, and let me see if I can manage my NuGet packages again. Let's see if we can see that. I think I might have just confused it a little bit. That's all. Remember, I mentioned earlier the two tabs of an integration, the hosting side. So if we look at these are extensions on the distributed application builder, and this adds the OpenAI capability, and it's a hosting package. So when I try one more time, and let's see what we get. So this is our Aspire hosting cognitive services. And you can see it's got some dependencies, but this is our hosting side that's going to generate OpenAI. And I don't have to add deployments here, but I can chain multiple deployments if I want. So if I wanted a new Azure OpenAI deployment, maybe I want it to be embedding as the name, and I want something like text embedding. I need to look up the actual model name, but easy enough to just add another deployment. So we've got our OpenAI here. We've got a deployment that will be created. I need these out in the Azure in order to run against my code. And I've added that reference to OpenAI and my chat deployment name here. So let me go ahead and double check how my solution is set up. If I look at my startup projects now, I really only need one single project on app host, and I can just go. Now this will build my application. This will start up the dashboard, and let me start debugging. So here is .NET You can see it's going to be using default Azure credential, and it's spinning up. It's going to be doing some stuff in local user secrets. And here is my dashboard. So we should be able to run our application. And this is the first thing you need to do for local Azure deployment. So if we look at our logs here, resource could not be provisioned because subscription location and resource group information is missing. And there's actually great documentation on this. If we look here, this goes through all of the different capabilities. It talks about what we just saw, that something's missing. Now we can do two different modes, like if we're publishing or if we're just consuming, but what we're going to be doing is this. We're going to be adding to our configuration our subscription ID, and that we want to allow creation and a region. We're going to give it a couple of pieces of information so that we can actually run this deployment. And I'm going to right click on my app host, and I'm going to manage user secrets. So right now this is empty. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to replace that with my information. So we got a location, we got a resource group, we got a subscription, and we're going to allow resource group creation. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to run this again. And again, we are spinning up. Now, I've run into problems in the past. I have a number of different subscriptions, and I've run into problems in the past where the subscription I've set with some of my things is different than the subscription that I'm logged into in Azure or logged into in Visual Studio. And I'll show you those couple of settings real quick. Notice this is now compiling an ARM template. This is actually going to do a deployment out to Azure and create that OpenAI instance and create a resource group. So I have a different demo I'll show you in a minute, but if we look, it just created this resource group, and if I give it a sec, or look at deployments, we can see that there's actually an OpenAI deployment happening right now, and it's starting to create resources, and then it will create the deployment on top of that resource. So once it creates OpenAI, it'll create the model deployment as well. So let me go back to my deployments, and it succeeded. Awesome. And notice it did role assignments. It created a deployment, created all the little bits I need. And if I come here, it's finishing up the deployment for the Aspire side. It's already got my front end running, and the back end will be running in just a sec. So there we go. AI is running, and now it started my API service. So I can launch my front end. And this is our same counter app that we had before, but now when I go to weather, it takes it a little bit longer, and we'll dive into why. So this is the easiest way to start consuming OpenAI, and I'll point out a couple of things as we go in 1 second. Again, this is the first time we're running it after deployment, so it's going to actually retry a couple times, and I'll take it a sec. We go here. So notice we've got some errors, and if we look at our console, yep, so we have some resilience event occurred. And I can actually go into my traces. I can see that all the retries that happen. So yeah, the first time this ran, this didn't really like it too much. Normally I don't have that problem, but I've been messing with the code a little bit, so it probably caused an issue. Try one more time. And then we'll dig into the code itself. Let's just dig into the code itself. So I mentioned that we've wired this up with reference to OpenAI. So in our website here, we've got our Aspire service defaults, and we've got our 2 API services. And if I just look at my client, it's just doing that call. It's just making that weather forecast call. That's all it's doing. But if we look on the back end at that API service, this is where things start to get interesting. So we've added Azure OpenAI client. This is that other side of the integration package. And so here we've got Aspire, Azure AI, OpenAI. And so we can just use that same name that we referenced in our app host, OpenAI, we can reference that same thing in our code. And this sets up dependency injection for OpenAI clients. I'll come back to this. This is semantic kernel, but right now I'm just focusing on that. So if we look at our weather forecast endpoint, here's our weather forecast endpoint. I can just reference OpenAI client. And so I've set up a deployment, an OpenAI resource with a deployment. I've set up a reference between that Azure deployment and my API service, and now I've set up dependency injection in my code to automatically go through and inject that client into my code. Now I'm passing that client to this weather summary, and this is where I'm getting a chat client and doing a completion. I'm setting a system message on helping give me a weather description. So can you describe the weather temperature in 1 word? And then I'm returning that completion. So let's try this one more time since I restarted it. And let's see what we get. Hopefully this time it's a little quicker. I think last time I ran this, I might have set a breakpoint, but I just wanted to double check. So there we go. So it took a little bit, but you notice I've got descriptions of various things. And if we look at our resources and we go to some of our logs, we've got all of our logs. We can see the retry events that happened. And if we look at our distributed trace, we can see how it got our credentials. It used the default credentials. So if I signed into the Azure CLI. And so it tried some things and I did a retry, and I can see all of that here in OpenTelemetry. Now, Let me go back to Visual Studio. Now, there's a couple of things to pay attention to if you run into weird authentication issues. One is I like to go to the options. So looking in the options, if you type Azure, there is a account selection. So if you have multiple accounts that you have access to, this is how Visual Studio will connect to Azure for debugging and auth and passing credentials. The other thing that's great is if you right click here, this will take you to your Azure provisioning steps where you can pick your subscription and information. So I set it up through user secrets, but you can get to it either way. So yeah, we're dependency injected our client. We're using our client just like we normally would. You can go out to .NET/AI samples and see a number of ways to use the Azure OpenAI client. I set up a system message and a user chat, and then they've just returned the text. Nothing too complex here. Let's take it a step further. Why don't we run it again? And this time, let's look at a chat client. Let's make a really basic chat client. And in this case, I am going to use semantic kernel. So to use semantic kernel with OpenAI in a .NET I needed to know my deployment name. And I love how I can easily say, hey, here's an environment variable with my deployment name, called it chat. Maybe I want to add another one for embedding. I could add that here, pass that variable as well. So now I'm pulling that out of the configuration system so I can get the deployment name or default to chat, and I can pass that to my semantic kernel. Add this completion. And that's really what I need to do to wire up semantic kernel with that chat service. Now, I put this code into a separate chat service that we can look at. And so it's not in line with the code like the weather summary is. I've got a little chat service here. And if we look at that, you can see I'm pulling a dependency injection from the kernel. I'm getting the kernel injected into my code base, and I'm getting the required service for chat completion, and I'm adding a message and getting the results back and returning that. So let's see what that looks like in our application. Again, this sample app, but I've got this chat. Now this chat doesn't really have history, and maybe we can start adding that on this call. And it definitely looks like I'm just getting a little bit of latency. So tell me about the speed of light. Now, something I added that I think is really nice when you're dealing with these OpenAI models is that sometimes it returns markdown. So give me and if you get just HTML or Markdown sent back to you, sometimes you want to render it. If I didn't have some code I'm going to show you, it wouldn't render this properly. And again, I don't really have history. If I asked it to tell me what it just told me, it doesn't have a history on the client side, so I haven't fully implemented that. But maybe we can do that in a second. But let's look at that rendering. So I do have this web app here. And so I've added into the web app some various components. You know, we have our weather component that was just doing that call to the weather, but we have a chat component, and it's very basic. For each message, display out who sent it. And I'll touch on that in a second, but we're just doing a send async. So when you type in a message and you hit the button, we're sending the message out and it gets the response. So ask the chat client to send that message and it gets a response back. We're not really persisting a lot of the history. We're not persisting that stuff, but we will as we play around with this. But in order to take that markdown and render it, I'm using a package called MarkDig. If I didn't want to do this, let's say I just want to return the raw text. It doesn't render the same way. So if I just did that and I did this and reran the application, what we'll get is something quite a bit different. Instead of nicely rendered bullet points and text, what we're going to end up with is raw markdown. And then once we're done with this, I'm going to show you one other little thing that I think will be really interesting, which is let's take this now and start deploying out to Azure. So here is our dashboard. And let's go to our application and chat. And let's see what happens when we're not rendering out our markdown the same way as we were before. So you can see we've got markdown text for highlighting, and it's not rendering out the bullets the same way. So MarkDig is a great way to render that out. Now, let's say we want to take our application and deploy it to Azure. So I could do an AZD init, and AZD init will scan my code base and generate an Azure YAML for me, and it can deploy all my resources. You can see it deployed a new resource group, a monitoring workstation, a container registry, my applications, my OpenAI, and then it listed out the endpoints that I can leverage to see these applications. And I can even go out to these resources running in Azure. Let me just show you them real quick and then we'll wrap up. So here's everything that got deployed. Just doing an AZD init and then an AZD up. It set up a managed identity and monitoring. It is deploying out my dashboard so that I can access everything. I had to authenticate to make sure I could access it. And yeah, there's my dashboard. So let's play around with .NET, play around with Aspire, and play around with OpenAI. And please check out all of the resources available. I want to thank everybody for the time today. I appreciate it.